What's up, guys? Welcome back to the Average American Podcast. I'm your host, Nathan Tate. This is the podcast for the average American by the average American. Thought we'd do something a little different today. It's the first time I'm trying it out. I bought some new software. Allows me to picture-in-picture and record the screen fully. So I figured we'd do Scott Horton's Part 2 on the U.S. Middle East. I did an episode on this, Part 1, previously. But I thought it'd be better to hear it straight from him. He's got a lot better explanations. Maybe some details that are not super relevant if you're not someone who's nerdy about this, like maybe him or I or Dave Smith or whoever. But I think it's still got a lot of good information that maybe we don't all know. It'll probably end up being a 2-part, maybe even a 3-part video. I'm not doing that on purpose. It's just for time constraints on my program and software that I use to upload to YouTube. So be on the lookout for that. But other than that, let's go ahead and give it away to the great Scott Horton.
Which, of course, brings us back to Iran. And now, of course, the U.S. foreign policy establishment has been absolutely obsessed with Iran since the revolution in 1979, but not absolutely. In fact, they waver back and forth. The Reagan administration and the Iranians famously had a covert relationship in the early to mid 1980s, which included the Iran-Contra scandal and the Reagan administration selling missiles to Iran by way of Israel, which again had stayed friends with the Iranians after the revolution. And so that was a big problem. Of course, the hostage crisis was a big deal. A lot of people, maybe even to this day in the State Department, certainly into the W. Bush years, were people who had friends who had been taken hostage in 1979 in the hostage crisis and things like that. So there was a lot going on personally there as beef between them. Now, famously, people like to bring up the Beirut attack of 1981, which was committed by sort of a proto-Hezbollah group.
For anyone that didn't watch the first video or doesn't know about it, in 1979 when the Shah got overthrown, and they brought in Khomeini to take over the Iranian Revolution, there was a hostage situation that ended up happening at the foreign embassy for the United States in Iran. And strangely enough, we were cool with the Iranians for about 10 months until that happened. So after the point at which we brought Khomeini in from Paris because he was exiled to take over, we were cool for about 10 months before that popped off late 1979. So let's continue.
Maybe the group that grew into Hezbollah later, soon after. They did a suicide truck bombing, killed 241 Marines and a bunch of French soldiers as well, and a few others at their barracks, asleep in their barracks in Beirut. It was an absolute catastrophe, of course. And but notably, Reagan was selling them missiles within 3 years. So when it comes to statecraft and all that, bygones are bygones. When necessity necessitates it, they don't care about stuff like that. Here, literally, 40 years later, we're supposed to still be
Sprite is not
so worked up about this that we can't get along with the Iranian government now, and which, ought to be a pretty obvious red herring when they have to reach back so often to this terrible attack in 1983, which, by the way, the Israelis knew was coming and did not warn the United States. And this is in the book By Way of Deception by Viktor Ostrovsky, that they knew this group was building this massive truck bomb, and they intuited what the potential targets were, including the American barracks there. And they decided.
I just want to point out that it's very interesting. He says the Israelis knew that this bomb from what is going to be known as Hezbollah later on, which, if you don't know, Hezbollah is a terror arm, if you will, a small terror militia, I guess is how I refer to them. That's part of the Iranian regime, or an ally of Iran, if I could say the word, Iran. So yeah, but That's not the first time that the Israelis had did anything like that, and it wouldn't be the last. Obviously, you go back to 2001 and the dancing Israelis. And then you know that there's a lot of speculation surrounding that Israel not necessarily played a part in 2001, but knew, I should say, that something imminent was on the rise and decided not to warn us. So,
Not to warn the Americans. They said they ought to be able to do this themselves, and this is what they get for sticking their nose in where it doesn't belong in Israeli policies there. And then also famously, Dr. Ron Paul, or should be famously to me, Dr. Ron Paul, he famously, this is famous. He put out a book called A Foreign Policy of Freedom because I insisted he have Jay Leno do a retake of their outro that includes his great book. And they put his book on the desk when he was on the Jay Leno show. So I'm famous now. And the book is A Foreign Policy of Freedom. And of course, I kind of borrowed from that, a tip to the hat to Dr. Paul for this Academy of Foreign Policy and Freedom, which I kind of named in honor of Dr. Paul in that sense. But so Dr. Paul, of course, he was in the House of Representatives in the 70s and 80s before going back to being a baby doctor and then returning to the House of Representatives in the late 1990s. But so he was there in his original term in the 1980s and including there in 1983. And in that book, you'll see a series of speeches where he says, Reagan, don't put our troops in Lebanon. Don't go to Lebanon. It's a huge mistake. The irrational politics of the Middle East are going to cause all these problems. And our guys could get killed. We could get sucked into a war and we should not be there. And then the next speech is, I told you, now 241 Marines have been killed, and it's a terrible mistake. We should have never been there. Mr. Reagan, whatever you do, don't double down. Just get out of there before it's too late. And then in the next speech, he says, congratulations, Mr. Reagan. You finally did the right thing and pulled the troops out of there. Too bad you didn't listen to me the first time. But good. He didn't say it like that. But now you've done the right thing and got the troops out of there. Thank goodness. But then on the way out, Reagan had the battleship New Jersey blast the Beirut suburbs. And there was soon after a hijacking of a plane out of Athens where the terrorists, they were Shiite terrorists from Lebanon, running up and down the aisles with their submachine guns, looking for Americans and saying, New Jersey, New Jersey. And one of the victims actually told the New York Times later, she says, why are they so mad at New Jersey? When it wasn't the state they were mad at, it was the battleship New Jersey that they were citing as the motive for their terrorism there. A fun little anecdote about that. But then, like I say, not long after that was the Iran-Contra scandal, where the Reaganites decided that they could get along with the Ayatollah after all. And this was the mean old Ayatollah Khomeini back then, but they had enough common interests as they were balancing back and forth in the Iran-Iraq war and trying to get the hostages released. And so Reagan had Israel sell missiles to Iran and then resupply the Israelis using them as the cutouts, as the cover, and then taking the money that the Ayatollah spent on the missiles and using that profit to then fund the Contra death squads in Nicaragua fighting against the commie Sandinista government there, known as the Iran-Contra scandal. The old Ayatollah died in 1989, and the current Ayatollah Khamenei took power then. And America really could have started normalizing relations with them at that point. But the Pentagon decided in 1991 that right as the Soviet Union was ceasing to exist, they decided that their new reason for being would have to be rogue states' possession of weapons of mass destruction and the means to deliver them. And so then, especially the threat from North Korea and Iran, that they could eventually achieve the missile capability to deliver chemical or even atomic bombs to North America or even to Europe, right? To threaten our allies with would be the threat in the name of Iran. And so the Pentagon decided they were going to build their policy around opposing this. And of course, then that kind of meant that precluded peace. If that's a reason for them to remain militant, then kind of militates against them wanting a long-term peace and normalization of relations with Iran. So that became a real problem at that time. And then the Israelis also had a new strategy under Yitzhak Rabin. And the point of the strategy was to reverse what had been the previous Israeli doctrine. This is the Shiites in dark green. Iraq was under Saddam Hussein, a Sunni regime. This is post 2003, this map here. Syria was a Shiite regime up until last December when Al Qaeda took it over. So that would be now in the light green category. These things do shift. But anyway, colors aside.
Just want to pause really quick. He was talking about Syria. Yeah, they put in Jelani. That's his name. Slick back Arab dude. You may have seen him in the White House, maybe like a picture or something. He was a Bin Ladenite head chopper from that terror regime in those years in Iraq and Afghanistan. And they just supplanted the government of Syria and installed Jelani. And even, there are several people who will say this. I think Scott Horton said it on the Rogan show as well. Maybe even Dave Smith has talked about it. But, this guy is radical and crazy and even has the Arabs kind of, on the ropes about whether or not he should be the leader of that country. So really making good choices, the United States. But onward.
If you take a good look here, you can see where Israel's this little country surrounded by all these at least potential enemies. And Yitzhak Rabin, the labor leader, decided, well, first of all, to reverse the strategy of the periphery. And the strategy of the periphery leading up to this was that Israel wanted to be friends with Turkey, Iran, and Ethiopia, just down here, in order to counter as a balance against Syria, Iraq, and Egypt, if that makes sense. So by backing Turkey in having an alliance with Turkey, that means the Syrians have to keep their forces divided north and south, which way they're looking. The Iraqis, a potential threat, have to have much of their military base facing east to protect against Iran. Egypt also is divided. Instead of just threatening Israel, they also have to watch their southern flank. This was the strategy of the periphery. Now, Yitzhak Rabin came and he changed that. He reversed it. He said, what we want to do now, actually, is we're going to negotiate a two-state solution, a pseudo two-state solution, not a real deal thing, but close. And anyway, as part and parcel of that policy, we're going to negotiate with Arafat and the Palestinians, but also make peace with the close-in Sunni states. They'd already made their peace deal with Egypt in 1979. And then here, they wanted to seek a permanent peace treaty with Jordan, which they got in 1994. And they wanted to essentially make peace with the rest of the Sunni states. And by the way, in the case of Egypt and Jordan, they had promised a two-state solution for the Palestinians as a condition of the peace deal in 79 and in 94. Now, here they're saying, we want to now turn the strategy of the periphery around. And part of that means demonizing Iran, turning on Iran and declaring them the enemy, even though they had been basically their covert ally this whole time leading up to that for, at this point, 14 years since the revolution. This is in 1993 is when they're making this switch. So then that was when Rabin was the one who really started to demonize Iran as sort of cover for dealing with the Palestinians and saying, arguing that the Israelis need to make peace with the Palestinians so that they can ally with the Sunni states in confronting Iran. And that was part of the policy there. And also, as one Israeli strategist explained to Trita Parsi in his great book, Treacherous Alliance, he said, by demonizing Iran, which was, of course, on the outs with the United States at that time, and by putting them under the umbrella of radical Islamic fundamentalism, this was, quote, new glue for the alliance with the United States. In other words, now that the Soviet Union was gone,
I just want to point out that Trita Parsi is a journalist, a Middle Eastern journalist, from what I understand, or European. I don't know 100%. When I first heard his name, I thought it was a peace agreement, like the Treaty of Versailles. So thought I'd clear that up for anybody else who's confused.
What use did Israel have to America anymore? What excuse could the Israelis come up with for their pro-Israeli American partisan friends to invoke for why we need them? And it was, there are our front. They're sort of our Fort Apache out there on the vanguard of Western civilization, holding it down in the East, facing down radical Islamic fundamentalist extremism. And now, of course, this could be anybody in the Middle East who's a Muslim. Call them an extremist. It kind of doesn't mean anything. I mean, there certainly are extremists, but also you can call anyone that. And what it really means, of course, is that it completely blurs the lines between who's Sunni and who's Shia, who's Syrian and who's Saudi and who's Iranian and who's on whose side anyway. Now you just get to gloss over all of that. And if the people of Palestine also are Muslims, great. Then we'll just call them radical Islamic extremism. So as an excuse to finish stealing their property too. And so it made a great kind of catch-all excuse, new glue for the alliance between Israel and the United States, and a way to conflate all of their enemies and potential victims with the United States. And they'll even say with no irony all the time that, yeah, Israel and America have all the same enemies. Yeah, but why do you think that is? It's because that's what Israel wants for us. When it doesn't have to be that way at all. Now, for example, right as, and this is again all in Treacherous Alliance, which is such a fantastic book, that just as the Bill Clinton administration is coming into power in 1993, they were considering a new policy of trying to get along with Iraq and Iran. Sorry, I got to pour some Dr. Pepper here. And so they wanted to normalize with Iraq and Iran. Clinton, though, had been foolish in saying so when he should have kept that under his hat. And when he especially had mentioned that he wanted to normalize relations with Iraq, the Israelis and the Kuwaitis swung into gear to prevent that from happening. And this is especially known by Americans as Saddam Hussein's plot to kill George Bush Sr., which vast majorities probably of Americans, at least who've ever heard of it or remember it, believe in to this day. And this was, I'm sure, legitimately thought by W. Bush in 2003 to be one of the reasons to attack Iraq, as he had been quoted as saying, he tried to kill my dad. Many Americans believe that, and I'm sure W. Bush did too. He wouldn't have known why that wasn't true. But it wasn't true. The whole thing was a hoax, and this was proven by the great investigative journalist Seymour Hersh, the guy that had uncovered the My Lai massacre and many other great stories in his career, and is still breaking stories from time to time. And Hersh told the story in the New Yorker, case not closed. And you got to subscribe to get it, or you can actually, guess I could have collected this. Well, it's too much to go through for this. But anyone can find this on my Twitter. If you just search for me and Seymour Hersh, Bush Sr., Iraq, Kuwait, something like that, I'm sure you'll find it. And there's a thread where I posted screenshots of the New Yorker article for those stuck on the other side of the paywall. They have a sophisticated paywall there that where archive.org is not sophisticated, or archive.is is not sophisticated enough to hop over their paywall. So I took screenshots, and it's the kind of thing, if people don't know this trick, you should know the trick. You do copy image, right click, copy image location, and then paste that into your browser. And then from there, you should be able to click on the little plus and zoom in one too. And if you zoom in on these JPEGs, you should be able to read them. They're legible enough. And this is the complete story. I have the whole story there from Seymour Hersh, case not closed. And the case is closed, but the other way. It's a preposterous farce that Saddam Hussein invented a plot to use a truck bomb to assassinate Bush Sr. It was just not true at all. It's a whiskey smuggling ring that Kuwaiti intelligence then embellished into this plot. And that was all there was to it. And there was kind of a fight between the CIA and the FBI. The CIA debunked it, but the FBI insisted that these explosives had to be traced to Iraq. And then the government wanted to hear that and all this stuff. And then guess what? The former Kuwaiti ambassador to the United States, whose daughter claimed that she had been a nurse at the hospital in Kuwait and watched the Iraqi soldiers throw the premature babies on the floor to die and steal the incubators. Well, he was the same guy who came up with the story about the truck bomb attack against Bush Sr. 3 years later in 1993, in order to essentially solidify Bill Clinton's turn away from the possibility of bringing Hussein back in from the cold and normalizing relations in any way. And Bill Clinton had been under severe pressure from the Rabin government to stay away from normalizing relations with Iraq or Iran. And they had a guy who was, it's just a term of art. You decide if he was an Israeli agent or asset to some degree. But Martin Indyk had been an advisor to Yitzhak Shamir, the Likud party prime minister who had preceded Rabin. And Martin Indyk.
For those who don't know what the Likud party is, the Likud is basically Israel's neocons. So the thing about Israel politics, they have like 7 different parties. They're much more, I guess if you want to say, diverse and liberal in terms of their political. Like you could win with 22% of the vote because it gets split up so much, which I guess, maybe that's worse than what we have. I don't know. That's really tough to kind of pinpoint whether it's good or bad. But regardless, that's who the Likuds are. Like, you'll hear people refer to them as the Likudniks.
Had then come to the United States, where working for the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, he founded WINEP, the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. And this was a direct spinoff. I mean, even in the paperwork, it was a direct spinoff of AIPAC, and it was meant to be so. And then after the alleged assassination attempt against Bush Sr., Bill Clinton went ahead and gave in and gave the nod to Martin Indyk to announce in a speech at WINEP the Israeli policy of American dual containment of Iraq and Iran. And so this was already in part, a policy that Bill Clinton was inheriting from Bush Sr. anyway, which was we're going to keep this blockade against Iraq. But Bill Clinton didn't have to keep the no-fly zones, and he didn't have to keep the blockade. He could have said, nah, whatever, Hussein sucks, but we can still normalize relations with him. We don't have to, there was no path to regime change, no obvious one. Keeping a blockade, a permanent blockade against the country wasn't going to achieve the overthrow of Saddam Hussein, and they knew that. But that was their avowed policy, but it didn't have to be that way, especially with the new administration coming in. But Bill Clinton went along with the policy. The other thing was the new Ayatollah had also helped to encourage the presidency of Rafsanjani, who was the new president of Iran, who's far from perfect. He's essentially a corrupt business criminal. But as a business criminal, that meant he was not a ridiculous theocrat. He had more, earthly interests and education, and wanted to get along with the West. Now, so this is a full 14 years after the Iranian Revolution. Again, Ronald Reagan's already had a covert deal with the
For anybody who was watching that, my power went out. It's storming here, so